So on behalf of the God Anthropology team, I want to welcome our second speaker of the year, Lisa Victor, who is a PhD candidate in the sociocultural subfield of anthropology at the University of Toronto. And she will be speaking about ghosts, priests, doctors, and witches, what we miss when we talk through science and belief. So our team already got to see a practice talk, and it's a really exciting narrative that's based on field work that Lisa did in Uganda. She just returned in September after being there for 14 months and has spent 2 years altogether doing work there. So please join me in welcoming Lisa, who will talk all about her experience.
Very much, and thank you all for coming out. I know that the weather is really nasty, so you all get bonus points for the test at the end. I don't know. Okay. So I'm going to open with a little bit of a story, and please forgive me as I read off the paper, and then I will engage with you a bit more directly. So, there is a small trading center in the Acholi sub-region of northern Uganda that for nearly 2 decades housed an internally displaced persons camp, at its height with a population of approximately 25,000 people, most of them children. By 2010, most of the camp residents had gone home, but according to the living and breathing residents of the trading center and the villages nearby, someone's no longer living, or some things that never were, still abound in the center and in the semi-wild spaces of the sub-county. Let me explain. The center of Palapir, a pseudonym which I'll explain a little bit later, consists of a kilometer-long stretch of ramshackle kiosks and buildings where villagers come to share news and gossip, worship in churches, drink gin and beer, listen to music and radio, buy sugar and salt and soap, and once a month have an auction day. I photographed this auction day, otherwise known as a market day, last December. At a similar auction day sometime around December of 1992, an unknown number of people selling and buying goods were massacred by a gunman or gunmen of indeterminate military affiliation. A few years later, approximately 400 residents of the camp were rounded up at dawn by rebel soldiers, marched about 10 kilometers into the bush, and separated by sex and age. Children below the age of 14 and nursing and pregnant women were forced to watch as the rest of the group were murdered by a riverbank. The commander of the killing was himself from Palapir. Welcome. But life and death continues unabated here. About 20 kilometers up the road is the border with South Sudan, which is periodically flooded by heavy rains and mud, or closed when things get violent in or around Juba, that country's nearby capital. The roadway is busy with traffic going to and from South Sudan, full of heavy tanker trucks and military convoys, Red Cross vehicles, rickety Matatu taxis and speeding passenger coaches, shiny new Land Cruisers with government number plates, and trucks from all over East Africa filled to the brim with goods and people stacked to perilous heights. At the far north end of Palapir Center sits the Catholic mission that has been there for about a century, and across from it is Palapir Elementary School, which is pictured here. In August of last year, a primary 3 student, a boy of about 9 years old, collapsed in his classroom there. At first, the boy's teacher thought he might have malaria, but he didn't act like it. He rolled around on the ground, shouting incoherently and crying, and acting rude, as the teacher put it. School staff tried to restrain him, but he was unusually strong at that moment and could not be held down. After several minutes of this, he gained consciousness and was reported to have no recollection of his collapse or his subsequent behavior. The deputy teacher took the boy home and asked his family if they knew of any reason why such a thing should happen, but they could only say that the day before he had eaten a piece of pork, which was an unusual and special occurrence. It was a mystery to them and to the teacher, but they resolved to press on until an explanation presented itself. Over the next 2 weeks, that thing, as the teachers called it, spread to the boys' 97-odd classmates, all in the same P3 class. Each of the students, particularly girls, would suddenly collapse or run out of the classroom like a wild animal, they said, shout and roll and scream and cry. The head teacher was alarmed and concerned and called in a physician from the local health center to investigate. When the doctor stepped across the threshold of the classroom block, 2 pupils collapsed immediately and writhed on the floor for between 10 and 15 minutes. Perhaps they've had too much sun, the doctor said. The parents of the affected pupils, about a quarter of the class, were asked to volunteer the personal history of their children, though each insisted that his behavior was not something that any of them observed at home. They were then instructed to bring them each individually to the health center, though no diseases were detected during the exercise. The children were given sedatives and sent home for arrest. The parish priest, the local chief, the elected local councillor, and concerned parents were called together with the teachers. When the community gathered in the church to pray about the problem, some of the children were overcome with dizziness and also succumbed to the thing. They suspected that the problem lay not with the individual children, but within the ground of Palapir itself. People began talking about what had happened at the school in the past. There had been gunfights, murders, torture, and many bodies had been buried on the school grounds. The school had periodically served as a barracks for both government and rebel armies throughout the 1980s and 1990s, and most likely during the early part of this century. Perhaps this problem of epilepsy is a disease of the brain, one teacher said. But perhaps the problem is caused by the angry spirits of the dead. Perhaps it's caused by something evil or something that was never human or alive, suggested another. They should be given medications and take the medications properly and be cured, said the first teacher, who then proceeded to suggest that the born-again Pentecostals, not the Catholics, needed to come and pray over the children at the school. Multiple other people, teachers, neighbors, and the sub-county councillor, each recounted to me a variation of the story that one of the children had contracted the thing when she went to the latrine and saw the hand of a munu, or a white person like me, coming out of the darkness of the pit. No, it was a black hand, said another one of the teachers, and more than one child saw it. Okay. Another student saw the entire body of a munu, or white person, hanging from the rafters in the latrine, only to disappear when she brought her friends to look at it. Still another saw a ghostly group of men hunched together as if gathered around a nighttime fire, eating a meal. The acting Rot Mo, or chief of chiefs in the sub-county, disputed those suggestions when I asked him later about it. He said it was a girl, not a boy, who had first contracted the thing and spread it to her classmates, and it had nothing to do with the violent deaths of war and insurgency, but it was because her and her friends kept playing under one particularly big tree on the school grounds. This is where the ancestors go to rest, he told me, and the tree had either been cut down by Chinese road workers who didn't understand its significance, or had been felled to make way for a new classroom block. By the time he spoke, things had quieted down at the school, and he said it was because of the prayers that had been done that the ancestors had been put to rest. No indigenous rituals, or acholi work, as it's called, needed to be done because it was a minor problem and prayer would work just as well as something stronger, he called it. But what about the white hand that comes out of the pit latrine, I said. What does that have to do with ancestors? If that had happened, I would have been informed, he said, so those people are just lying to you. It wasn't quite clear what was going on, but frankly nothing was. The story of the primary school, like everything else in Palapir, seemed impossible for me to get straight. People avoided talking about most things, people lied to me, people contradicted themselves, people looked at me with great suspicion. The only thing that was certain was that I hadn't a clue what was actually going on. Come on, there we go. So this was Palapir for me for a great majority of my field work. When I was back in Gulu Town where I lived, I told my foreign friends, NGO workers, and fellow researchers alike about this story. The most common reaction I had was the pronouncement that these kids were clearly traumatized or maybe even had post-traumatic stress disorder. But while I wanted to know what they meant by trauma, as none of them were actually psychologists, they wanted to know with very sly smiles if I actually believed in ghosts. I came back to Uganda after some time away because I wanted to learn more about how people respond to things like the school of maybe possessed kids in Palapir, and what their beliefs and actions have to say about history and violence and community ethics in a place where recently a tremendous amount of very dark things have happened. I'm going to tell you a bit about that tonight, and I'm going to talk to you about what happens when I tell people stories like the one about Palapir Primary, and perhaps the wheels are already turning in your head, and what people's reactions to it say about our own time and place in the world. So I want to know a few different things. What is the thing? So, like my conversations with parents and teachers and neighbors, what's causing kids to roll around on the floor at school? Why are some people mad and others claim to be haunted by ghosts? What is going on here? What is this thing? What goes on around the thing? So what's the context of life here in Palapir and in places around Acholi? What's the history? How do people think about the world and in so doing think about the thing? How should we talk about the thing? What does language have to do with the way we approach the thing or talk about it or react to it? And what does the thing do? Socially, how do people react or even create the thing? Why is it that everyone, for example, lies about the thing? What is at stake when they talk about it or acknowledge it? What the heck is this lady talking about? Okay, so let me bring it down to a bit more of a simple level. So first, some background. So this is Uganda on the east coast of Africa. The red dot, which should appear, there it is. The red dot is the part in north in the Acholi subregion where I based my work. So to give you a little small background to Uganda, the British came and set up a conglomerate of kingdoms and chiefdoms into a colonial regime that we now call Uganda. And that name comes from the Baganda who live in the southern part of the country. That protectorate lasted from 1894 to independence in 1962. And along the way, they changed some things as the British liked doing. What the colonial protectorate did was something that had proven useful for them elsewhere, and that was to gain political and economic control through an institutionalized policy of divide and rule. So northerners, particularly the Acholi, were branded as fierce warriors and best suited to military professions, and southerners were regarded as easier to develop, quote-unquote develop or civilize, through economic and political routes. These were ethnic stereotypes that very much continue to this day, and crudely speaking, there is a persistent political divide and tension between the fortunes of the North and the South. So by the time Uganda gained its political independence in 1962, politics had been militarized and patronage was entrenched as the way to get things done. To give you a sense of how that continues today, Parliament has seats reserved not only for MPs, but 10 out of 375 seats are permanently reserved for members of the national military. Though independence was a peaceful affair, since then there has never been a peaceful transfer of executive power, not once. Instead, there have been a succession of coups and dozens of armed insurgencies, 14 to my latest count, it could be higher than that. In the 1970s, a general called Idi Amin, who you may have heard of, overthrew the government and led a reign of terror until he himself was overthrown. Then there was a civil war that went on until the mid-1980s, and the rebel commander of the National Resistance Army then took power, and he's been president ever since. I've recently heard Uganda's government described as a hybrid regime, which is sort of a fancy way of saying that it's sort of a democracy, but it's also a bit authoritarian, and we're not quite sure what's going to happen. In the north, however, things did not settle down after 1986. There have been nearly a dozen armed insurgencies, or more than that, as I mentioned, but most of them, and the longest lasting, have occurred in the Acholi subregion. For the sake of time, I can't tell you tonight about all the rebel history of the area, but all of these rebel groups in the north eventually congealed in the late 80s into what we now know as the Lord's Resistance Army, or LRA. And you maybe have heard of them or their leader, Joseph Coyne, through viral video fame and things like that. So from 1986 to 2006, an estimated 60,000 people, children, youth, and adults, but mostly children, were abducted to serve in the LRA in various capacities. Many of those people were killed, many escaped or were released, or captured by the Ugandan army, and many are still missing. The boy that you can't see in this photo, for example, was granted amnesty when he escaped from captivity. In 2006, a ceasefire was enacted between the LRA and the government of Uganda, and that allowed a lot of people to escape home. But while the LRA was expelled from the north, they've still been operating sporadically but very destructively in the Central African Republic, the DR Congo, South Sudan, and Sudan proper. But the LRA is not the whole story. At the same time that the LRA was operating in Acholi, the government and its army forcibly relocated the majority of civilians in the Acholi subregion into insecure, underserved, and squalid internally displaced persons camps, or IDP camps, which are basically refugee camps without any of the benefits of international law. By 2005, 90% of civilians in the subregion were living in IDP camps. So let's think a little bit about what that was like. Boom. I took this picture in 2008 when the camps were still there, and this gives you a sense of what conditions were like there. A whole host of social, medical, political, and economic problems arose from life in the camps. To begin with, the vast majority of people in the region are subsistence farmers. They were forced to leave their land fallow and had virtually no way of earning income aside from brewing alcohol. If people tried to leave, they were likely to be killed either by government soldiers who would accuse them of being rebel collaborators, or by the LRA accusing them of being government collaborators. The camps were officially called protected villages, but the thing was that the camps were built around security detaches, if around anything at all. And so they were notoriously insecure, and some say that they actually made things easier for the LRA because they acted like concentrated people and goods, so it was one-stop shopping for raids. Back in the villages, where people have started moving back, the impact of the camps is still felt. The biggest impact that I want to talk to you about tonight is this idea of cultural transmission, and by this I just mean the ways in which older generations teach younger generations the skills and values and moral concepts, as well as more stereotypical things that we think of as culture, history and myth and language and special rituals and all that good stuff like that, and ways of dealing with the world. So traditionally, Acholi kids learned from their elders at the nighttime wang-o, or fireplace. So you can see in the middle of this picture, oh yeah, I'm gonna do this. This is where the fireplace was, and still is. So this is where people would sit around the fire after supper, learn stories and songs and parables about how to navigate their way through the world, and it gave them a sense of identity as well. But in the camps, the houses were very, very close to each other, and in a normal village compound, you have quite a distance between these grass thatch houses, as you saw. So fire was an enormous hazard, and that was the cause of a great deal of suffering in the camp when a spark would set everything off, and people regularly lost all of their belongings. To add to that, a nighttime fire can obviously also act as a beacon. So when you're concerned about nightly raids or attacks from outside, you don't want to have a giant neon sign alerting everyone to your presence. So it was quite common that nighttime fires were banned. But another more curious reason about why wang-o didn't happen had to do with how families distributed themselves in the camps. although entire villages were often moved en masse to the camps, and that's how they accessed their food rations and that sort of thing. It wasn't unusual for families to deliberately distribute themselves throughout a camp so that if one part of the camp was attacked, they wouldn't all be abducted at once. So you might not be spending your evenings sitting around with your extended family like you normally would. So say you're a young person and you spent 10 to 15 years living in an IDP camp, or maybe you were even born there. You were raised dependent on food aid and other handouts, and you don't know your family very well, even though that's the basic unit of social welfare and support that your society is based upon. By about 2010, most of the camps had closed and most people had gone back to their home villages. But the older generation that's still alive, and there were many who were killed or succumbed to disease during the war, those who are still alive complain that Acholi youth don't know how to be quote-unquote Acholi. And just as many youths complain about this fact as well. So for example, this drum here is used for brewing alcohol, and these young men who are in the picture, I seem to recall it was around 8 or 9 in the morning, and they were totally shit-faced. So, because there's really nothing else to do. So, we have this problem about cultural transmission. So, one of the basic concepts we learn in sociocultural anthropology is that there's no such thing as a default culture. There's no starting point of purity or tradition. It's something that always exists in the here and now, and there's no reference point for authenticity. Culture isn't a thing that some people have more than others. It's a really fluid idea, and it's not tangible. It's more than just, nice dances and interesting clothes. But what traditional culture is usually something that speaks more about the motivations of whomever is claiming it than tradition itself. However, this anxiety over cultural change has been there for some time, and it's a very old concept. And if you read an ethnography from the 1950s about Acholi, you'll get an overwhelming sense of worry that things are changing and that automatically that is a bad thing. I bet all societies have this worry to an extent. We certainly have this in our own. But I think this is beyond that normalcy that over people complaining about kids these days. Something bigger is happening here. There's a saying in Acholi, which is, do not uproot the pumpkins from the old homestead. It basically means change things, but don't forget who you are. So there's a real identity crisis, and there are competing notions of what it means to be a good Acholi person or a good human being. And this is when things get complicated when it comes to the thing. How do we deal with the thing? So how do we go about figuring out what the thing is if we don't really know how, for example, the last generation would have dealt with this? I have to explain over and over again to people that I'm not trying to scientifically prove, for example, if ghosts exist. That's not my purpose. I didn't buy an EMF meter for my field work or go around with anything like that. I'm not a Ghostbuster. No. Yeah. So I wasn't there to debunk anyone or to point at people or be entertained by their suffering. It's not fun, and Sam and Dean Winchester certainly never visited me. The point was rather to take things at face value. If ghosts are socially real for people, then they exist, and that was good enough for me. They have a life of their own, and we can sort of think about this in the same concept that we think about race. So race is a useless concept if we think of genetics and biology. There's more, for example, human variation between so-called races than there is, within so-called races than there are between them. But we wouldn't say that race doesn't exist. It's, of course, a very, very potent social reality. So the same thing can be said for things like the thing. So this is a tricky thing in academia. There's a strange idea that to be neutral means to have no belief. So, for example, we have Karl Marx here, who, if you've ever heard of him, said that religion is the opiate of the masses. So the idea was that if you have some sort of faith, it probably means that you're oppressed in some way and you're missing the big picture. This cartoon here, it says in French, there's an old man talking to children, and he says, children, if I have one piece of advice to give you, it's abstinence. Abstain from all religion. And this was a cartoon that I saw every day above my desk during my master's degree, because that was sort of seen as like the very, very academic way of thinking about religion. Don't get sucked into it. But of course, things like atheism can be just as evangelical as the rest of them. So the point here is to talk that maybe belief isn't the best way to think about the thing, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But the point I'm trying to get at here is that it's not about what I think, it's about what the people of Palapir think, and it's about taking them seriously as fellow human beings and not looking down our noses on them or pitying them or seeing them as somehow ignorant for having certain ideas. So, that has a lot to do with how we rank knowledge. What do we consider good knowledge? What do we consider worthwhile knowledge? So if we take people's explanations seriously, it means just looking at consistencies. It doesn't mean that there aren't mad people or frauds. There are plenty of frauds in every society. But it's about leveling the playing field for different ways of knowing. Okay. So that also means challenging our own categories of the world and trying to challenge ourselves into thinking about what are the ways that we think of life in the world that we maybe thought of as natural. So these days, at least here, for example, in Toronto, we have these discrete categories for science and religion and culture, etc. But if we look back into the history of these ideas, we find that they're not necessarily mutual givens. So I'll give you an example. The kids in these photos, they're walking down to this little stream in their village. I had gone down there a day before and seen kids like them and a woman washing clothes. They all looked at me like they had literally seen a ghost. Nobody greeted me, which was very, very strange. And everybody stopped playing, stopped doing what they were doing, and I sort of just walked away really awkwardly, wondering what I had done. I went back to my village home, my family's compound, and I told them what had happened, and they said, well, they probably thought you were a spirit. I said, but they've seen me before, and he said that earlier in the week, somebody had seen a spirit in the form of a white person on that very riverbank. So I thought that was quite curious. But the point I'm trying to get at here is that what they thought was a spirit had nothing to do with their religion. It was just life. They were just seeing me as part of the natural landscape, as something that happens. It was something that they couldn't understand, they couldn't quite explain, but it had nothing to do with a quote-unquote religion. So what we call these ideas that are religion are just how people live their lives. We have ritual in our lives that has nothing to do with spirits and vice versa. We have ritual in religion that has nothing to do with spirits. But in a way, we've sort of categorized these things so that we can try and make sense of them, and we've called some things religion and some things spirituality and some things weird and some things just very foreign, or we call some things culture. So if you can just try and move with me a little bit and try and think about all this stuff as just a given life for some people. I promise this will make sense soon. I hope it does. So, what goes on around the thing? Why do we have these certain categories? Where do they come from? Why do we categorize the thing in some ways? So, as I said, categories, even though they're problematic, they help us describe things, they help us sort of get a hold of things. So, there are broad categories in Acholi that we can think of, bless you, throughout how we can think about the thing. So I will describe those categories to you. So we have elders. They're called Kwaro, which curiously also means ancestors. So elders are seen as sort of a bridge to the living and the dead. And they're there to direct people on how to live their lives, on what to do when huge problems arise, but also what to do ritually speaking when something happens, like when a thing comes about. So for example, this grandmother here was directing her grandsons on an exhumation of some bodies who had been buried during the war, and they needed to be buried back in their home villages. So grandmother sat there all day in the sun, telling them how to go about things so that they wouldn't be infected by a thing. And in that case, it would have been the angry spirits of the dead if they mishandled the remains incorrectly. This picture is not the greatest, but that says Dakta, or doctor, and this is a picture from Anajwaka. Anajwaka in English we might call a diviner or a local healer, or in sort of less PC terms, a witch doctor. So different types of Ajwaki exist. They do sort of local healing, divination, they have ritual specialties, and some are commercial and some of them aren't. Some of them are clearly sort of quacky, and some of them are people who are really specialists. Wow. At dealing with the spirit world. So if somebody wants to make use of Najwaka and they're having a problem in their life, they would go in and they would sit down and they would say Tuo Tie, which just basically means sickness is there. And then they let the Ajwaka take over. Then we also have the more formal religious leaders and institutions. So in the Acholi sub-region, there is a huge presence of Roman Catholics. I'd say probably about 90% of the population adheres to Roman Catholicism, for example, seen here. There's also a smaller group of Anglicans, and there's also an even smaller group of Muslim adherents. Excuse me. And that sort of formal mainstream Christianity has been around for about the last 100 years in Uganda, and is quite successful and thriving. But that is not it. Pretty sure my nephew is not part of the epistemology. Okay, and now we have something which is a bit more new, and that's Pentecostal Christianity. So that's a certain type of Christianity that is based on Pentecost, which was when the Holy Spirit was received by the people that Jesus Christ had left behind. And Pentecostalism in Uganda, as elsewhere, has a sort of certain flavor to it, which I don't have time to get into today. But it's very much based on something called the prosperity gospel, which is basically seeing how prayer can lead to riches, earthly riches, and success, and certain ideas that are thought of as modern. So usually there'll be advertisements like this. There's words like downloading heaven, and there's always has to be an international speaker to grant it legitimacy and all that sort of thing. But this is probably the fastest growing type of Christianity in Uganda, as it is probably in the entire world. Now, for Pentecostalists, in comparison to the other Christian sects, all Ajwaka are considered witches, and even though the mainline Christian groups do not think this, the Pentecostals will not participate in any sort of rituals that they deem as cultural. And cultural is just used as a euphemism for evil. And lastly, we have NGOs and humanitarianism, which are, I would argue, seen as sort of a way of salvation as well these days. So everybody and their dog has an NGO in northern Uganda. It's sort of based on sort of this technocratic idea of what it means to be a successful person. And it's also very deeply ingrained in the local culture. So people sort of take up the language of NGOs and humanitarianism to grant themselves modernity legitimacy. So for example, if you go to a wedding planning meeting for somebody. I've been to a wedding planning meeting where there was a chair and people had notes and followed Robert's Rules of Orders, and it would be like that for a family meeting as well. So it's very, very deeply ingrained. Again, the Winners' Chapel. This is a nerd joke. So epistemology, if you don't know, is just a fancy way of saying, it's the study of ways of knowing. So all of these could be called different epistemes. They're different ways of knowing the world, of interacting with the world. However, all these categories bleed together. An Ajwaka can also be a Christian. Even though I said Pentecostalism is sort of the most radical because it doesn't agree with the merging of categories. Of course, in practice, life is quite a bit more messy than that. But the mainline churches are quite happy to enculturate themselves and to be relevant to local people. So for example, a way that these categories sort of meld into each other is how, even though we're living in a very militarized society there, the military has also bled its way into spirituality. So, and I don't choose the word bleed unintentionally. So for example, this is a fetish from a local Ajwaka who brought me into his hut, and he had all these different things, you know, beads and rocks and seashells and that sort of thing, and he had a toy gun, and it's because he has certain helper spirits, which used to be soldiers. And this is quite common, so often in reporting about the LRA, one way of sort of a shorthand way of saying that they're brutal and barbaric is to say that they have all these strange ritual and spiritual practices, but the truth is that it's completely internally consistent within Acholi and Ugandan society. However, there are people who are deeply suspicious of motivations of blending these categories, and they want to use these categories for a reason, to distinguish themselves, to be modern, to be quote-unquote authentic, to be traditional or cultural, or this sort of thing. So, this is where I come in, and it gets really difficult in trying to figure out what people actually think, because people censor themselves. They say what they think that I want to hear. This is especially the case if people assume that I'm a missionary, and their story changes when they find out that I am actually a researcher. However, trying to convince people that I wasn't a government spy or there to make money off of them was an uphill battle, and I'm not entirely sure that I succeeded in doing that. But what I want to make here as a point is the idea that people will project certain aspects of themselves on purpose, and it tends to reinforce these categories and ideas, and it makes things awfully confusing. So, again, suspicions about why I was there. So, people are trying to understand my motivations, and they're living in a society where things get pretty shady, so people don't take you at your word. So this was very difficult for me when I was talking about something so taboo as the thing, and trying to find out about what was actually going on. So I often had people tell me that nothing was going on at all, and that I would read about it in the paper the next day and come back and say, well, that's not what they said in the paper. And they said, okay, well, what do you want to know? So, Ajwaka Onyo Ajwani means Ajwaka, diviner, or Ajwani, dirty thing. So, you can see here, for example, in the picture, the Ajwaka has a picture of Jesus, or what he imagines Jesus to look like. Probably not a white guy, but he has his toy gun, he has all of his other fetishes, and this is not considered contradictory at all. These are all just different ways of interacting with the unseen world. The thing that all of these ideas have in common is that everyone is trying to navigate their place in the world. So please don't go home and tell your loved ones that I said all religions are about morality, because that's not the point I'm making. The point I'm making is that people's relationships to these ideas and how they respond to the thing have to do with how they find their way through ethically confusing times. So, how do we talk about the thing then? If we have all of these sort of different competing groups, we've got Pentecostals, we've got local diviners, we've got Roman Catholics, we've got NGOs, we've got white anthropologists, all of these things. For example, this is just a very small example of all the different ways that we could talk about the thing. So, ajwani, as I mentioned, means dirty thing, and a lot of times when people can't define a thing, they'll just call it ajwani. We're not sure what it is, but it's bad. Yeah, laser. Chen. Chen is the malevolent spirit of a person who is basically killed unjustly or violently, or who dies what they consider a bad death. Gemo could be a lot of things. I heard it described as measles. I heard it described as ghosts. Not quite sure. Aiwea, that is a spirit that lives in big trees. Jok, or jogi, which is plural. An ajwaka is helped by many jogi. So jogi are considered sort of natural spirits that live on the landscape. And depending on who you talk to, they're good or they're bad or they're nothing. They're just jok. Kwaro, as I mentioned, the living dead. They're both living and dead. So those are the ancestors who could be considered our living grandparents or our dead grandparents. We're not quite sure. Tipu, that could be your soul. It could be a shadow. Not really sure. Yesu Christo, you know that guy, Jesus. Lubanga or Lubanga. These are the Catholic and Protestant ways of talking about God. But there's a lot of debate over the fact that Rubanga used to be actually a jogi. So we're not quite sure what's going on there. Shaitan is Satan. Demons are demons, and that's the same. Lapir, for example, from Palapir, is a jok who is known for haunting people who don't keep their word. So I thought I was very clever in calling this place Palapir because there has been no accountability there. So you should congratulate me on my cleverness. Okay, so everybody wants to know, well, what do you actually believe is going on? I do actually understand the question, and I will respond to it. But I'm going to try and get you guys away from thinking about belief, if that's what you're thinking, and I know you're thinking that. So, the problem of belief. There's a long history about the word belief in the English language. What we now think of as belief is the same thing as convinced that something exists or is true. Or we think of it in an empirical sense, as in, that is there, it's tangible, it's for real, it's scientific. So if you say, I don't believe in God, you are probably saying there is no such thing as God. But it wasn't always this way, and it isn't this way in all languages. So if we separate this idea of faith from existence, we have we'll get a better sense of what is happening in Acholi. So, Jogi Tie Ento Peageno. This is, again, in the Ajwaka's hut. This is, if you can understand the scale, this is a floor to ceiling length box that Jogi are said to live in. It's very, very common when you ask somebody, do you believe in Jogi? They'll say Jogi Tie, that means Jogi exists, or rather Jogi is there. Ento, but Peageno, I don't put my faith in it. So that is not a contradictory statement in Acholi to say that, yeah, it's there, but I don't believe in it. That's not contradictory at all. So what that means is that those categories of belief and existence are totally separated. And it means that a lot of foreigners are very, very confused about what people actually think is going on. So it begs the question, what is natural and what is supernatural? Outside here of the Ajwaka's hut, all these little Stonehenge guys, these are all representations of local hills that have certain Jogi attached to them. However, Jogi exists naturally in nature, and there is no supernatural. It's just part of life. So the question is never, does this thing exist, but it's, do I think it's ethical to acknowledge it or interact with it or give in to its demands? People know that something is fraudulent or when something is a psychological problem, so that's not really a problem here. For example, in Ajwako, I've heard Ajwaka suggest that somebody needs to go to a psychologist or a doctor. And a community will know when someone is being framed for witchcraft, for example. But they're never rejecting the ideas outright. They're never saying things don't exist or that they aren't there. What they're saying is we should deal with it in a certain way. So, what does the thing do? As I mentioned, ancestors and elderly people are sort of in this liminal, if you'll excuse the word, but they're in this sort of in-between place of life and death. And this points to the idea that the dead are not totally dead in Acholi. They come back and they ask for things. They ask to be buried properly, they ask to be buried at home, they ask to be cared for in the afterlife, they ask for offerings of food and drink. One of the massacres I told you about, this is a memorial for them, and I was struck by the fact that there's only one, even though there's been a handful of massacres in Palapir. And you can't actually read that plaque there. It's completely faded. But people are missing, so people are struggling with a way of trying to commemorate them because they don't have these physical bodies to bury at home. So the question then remains is how do we account for people when we don't know where they are and we're not really entirely sure what happened to them. So I asked people a lot to tell me a little bit more about these massacres and who was missing and what the connection between spirits bothering the townspeople and the missing bodies was. So as I mentioned, a properly buried body is interred at home and is cared for, and that body will not bother you. But if we went to the site where this massacre occurred, a lot of the bodies still remain there. Their remains were spread by wild pigs because during the insurgency it wasn't safe enough to go and collect the bodies. And it begs the question of, well, what has happened to the spirits of those bodies? And what would happen if we went and visited that site? If this is going to have a bad effect on people, that would mean it was also going to have a bad effect on me. And I didn't want people to think that I was like this. I wanted them to know that I was generally interested in not prolonging people's suffering or re-traumatizing them. So, I struggled with this throughout my field work about whether or not I should go to the site where this massacre happened. I told people, I told elders, I told the local chiefs what I was intending to do. I wanted their opinion. I asked the massacre survivors if I should go or not. Mostly I got lies and obfuscation and no clear answers. And then I was told that certain rituals had to be done, and then other people said, no, those rituals have already been done, they just want money from you, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I went around in circles for about a year. The week before I left, my friend and research assistant volunteered to go up to Palapir on his own one afternoon. And the first person that he talked to on the street happened to be the person who owns the land upon which this massacre happened. So he told them about my project and he agreed to bring us there. But I really wanted to sit down with them first and talk about why they were willing to take me there and what the risks were for them and for me. So first we crossed the river, we waded into that spot, we thought about it, we talked about it the entire way. How much money did they want to take me there? What sort of things were happening at that site? What would happen to their kids if they got infected with something like the thing? Would I cause a spirit to be angry if I showed up there? Am I just an asshole? I don't really know. So we talked about all these things. we got there. And when we got there, they decided that it was okay, they were confident, they were strong men. The women wouldn't come with me because women are more fearful, I was told, and are more likely to contract things like the Finn. So I went up behind them, and we were quite deep into the bush, and all of this grass was actually really sharp, and if you were close to me, you could see I still have scars here. The grass actually cut me, and my arms and hands were bleeding by the time, and they turned around and they saw that I was standing there just dripping blood a little bit. And I think they were a bit worried about their decision. So but I was also sort of curious about what had happened, and I didn't know if it was my own psyche, or if God had led me there, or if it was the spirits who were doing this to me, or even if it was something evil, or if it was just that there was sharp grass. But Emmy, my research assistant, and I, we talked about it that night, and we talked about intention. Because again, we all just wanted to do the right thing. And I wanted to talk about why there's so much silence about these massacres in the community, even if that meant that I made people unhappy with me. Because acknowledging what we don't know is a step. And if we're to maintain our relationship with the dead, as you must in Acholi, we have to first know who the dead are. So what happens when we don't know? Why do we acknowledge one massacre and not the other? For example, actually when Jessica Trombley put up a link yesterday on the God Anthropology site, and it was a link to this timeline, this BBC timeline of events in Uganda, and I went through it, and I just sort of laughed to myself because it just seems like a very, very random collection of things. And you know, there was one massacre that was on there out of more than I can even account for, and I didn't really know why that was there, and I guess it was just that there was a reporter around at the time. So what happens when we don't acknowledge? We get anger and we get fear. I took these two pictures at the same event at Palapur Primary School on Easter Sunday, which was also happened to be the 19th anniversary of that very large massacre. While the religious leaders and the local MPs were speaking, several people from different parts of the crowd came in, and they were so drunk that they could barely talk or stand. And there was other people who were considered to be the crazy people in the community, and they kept trying to take the mic and shout about what was going on. So we get people coming into the community, MPs and local chiefs, or sorry, like the Paramount Chief, for example, would never spend the night in a place like Palapur. So we get the sense that people don't care so much, and that people are left to their own devices, and that often means alcohol. However, this goes beyond individual psychology. Of course, there are people who need help, and treating one person for PTSD, for example, might help, but it doesn't address the weight of history or the weight of the present. But the truth remains that there isn't a lot of resources in northern Uganda. I think there's there was two psychiatrists in the north, and one of them died in August. So the doctor is out. Having said that, there are no simple solutions. Not to sound trite, but it's sort of the whole human condition that we're dealing with. And there's not much we can do to make people undead or undo decades of war. So, as much as I've talked about diversity and how different this place is compared to what we're used to, I think it's safe to say that there's a universal human need to be remembered, to not be forgotten. So, why are people so afraid to talk then, to talk about those people who are missing? This is a mass grave which exists about 15 to 20 kilometers south of Palapur. It exists at the mission compound, and when I asked the local priests why the grave wasn't marked, and I asked them who was there, they said that they actually had raised the money to put up a memorial and to document it, and they were threatened repeatedly until that they let the issue drop, and it's now just next to the car park. So it's obviously something that isn't deep in the past. It's something that still hits a nerve, especially when we're not quite sure who perpetrated what massacre or what atrocity. And to give you an idea of how sensitive this issue is, just for me going there, I was followed by government agents who asked about me and my motivations for being there as well. So, politics are unfinished. People don't want to talk about these things, not just because they're taboo, or they're worried about what people will think of them, or if they're not modern enough, or if they're not a good Christian, or they're not a good traditional person. They're also afraid of getting murdered. So people look for meaning and they look for hope, because there's not much else to look for. So 11 months after that original problem at Palapir Primary, or at least 11 months since I'd heard of that original problem, it happened again at the school, and I heard about it on the radio that time. I went up to Palapir the next day to talk to the head teacher again, and he was annoyed that I found out about it on the radio because the school wasn't closed and he thought it looked bad for the community. Again, he was very concerned about putting up appearances. This time, a self-proclaimed apostle had come and prayed over one of the girls, and she had attacked him. The neighbors said that the elders needed to do something, and the head teacher said that elderly people are needy, and I always want food and care, and he can't afford to live up to their ritual demands. Everyone pointed the fingers at each other. We had the same discussion about what the thing was. They continued to avoid my calls, and people went on. I learned more about the bodies that had been unearthed when they dug out the pit latrine about a month before I had arrived the year before. People had different stories about who the body belonged to, but the most common story had to do with the suspected witch killer who had been tied to a goalpost by the army and executed in front of a camp full of families. So who gets to decide who is a witch, who is guilty, who should die, and who should live? And why is there no memorial for that man? I was going to say that the children are our future, because I couldn't think of a good way of concluding. But I would say that the spirits are our past and our future. So, to go back to the title, what we miss when we talk through the language of science or belief or religion or any of these categories is that the language itself for the thing is a prism through how we understand it. For the case of Palapir, it's a lesson in picking apart those categories of life that we might take for granted here. What is religious, what is spiritual, what is belief, or what is science? The danger in those categories is that they sometimes act to distort or even silence the things that bleed, literally and figuratively, into all of those ways of thinking about and existing in the world, or how we even define what the world is. My challenge to you tonight is to go away with the idea that there is something at stake in those categorizations, and that some people benefit and some people lose when we compartmentalize life. Because if in Palapir, spirits are political, and I would argue that they probably are here too. Thank you.